Hey everybody, welcome to Tip of the Spear. And as always, we're trying to bring the best voices out there in the nation and around the world to weigh in on the subjects that are at hand. Biblical things that are happening, prophecy that's happening, and then also worldview things. How does the Bible relate to this or that particular issue? And so on today, we have one of my good friends, Mondo Gonzalez. He's the host of Prophecy Watchers TV program and their daily podcast. He's a good friend of mine. I've been traveling with him all over the place. He's a pastor, he's a graduate of Moody Bible Institute. He holds a graduate degree in biblical archaeology. He's led multiple tours to Israel. And again, like I said, we have partnered in speaking in Europe, and we've done Australia, New Zealand, different places like that. So he's been a great ally, great friend, and we're pleased to have you, Mondo. Thanks for joining us, my friend.
It is great to be here.
Hey, man, I didn't get a chance to go with you guys to Australia and New Zealand this year, but kind of help our audience understand what's the climate like over there, the spiritual climate, the churches. What did you notice this year going a second time?
Yeah, to me, I walked away with, we all understand and recognize the challenges that we have here in our country as it relates to churches being faithful, just to the gospel, and then even more so to the understanding of prophecy. And the one thing I walked away with is whatever we think we have it bad here, it is way worse.
Really?
In Australia and New Zealand, even in the UK, as we've traveled together to those places, we recognize that God still has a very strong remnant here in America. And but you go there, and they have a tough time even finding a church that preaches the gospel at all.
Wow.
And so to me, it was reiterated this year in that whatever we saw last year when we went is even worse now. As we know, even in Australia, as an example, they've already brought out the digital ID. They're far ahead, and they just reelected like their own Kamala Harris, if you wanted to say it. It was shocking. It was shocking. And they couldn't believe it. I said, how in the world does this happen? Because it was well known. But they just said, you know what? Sadly to say, God gives us what we deserve in our leaders.
Yeah, wow. So let me ask you this. I mean, when I was there too, there are churches there, but they're either woke or is that same trend happening? They're just, what are they doing? Giving pep talks or TED Talks? What are they doing in these churches over there?
It's exactly what you just described. It's wokeism, it's feel good, it's seeker sensitive, it's all the stuff. Even some of the churches that might be bigger a lot of it are into the prosperity gospel. Those are the ones that, again, we no surprise in that regard. But for example, when we were in Melbourne, a great pastor there, and he's got a great church. He's been there for 15 years, an American, but he has been there. God called him to be there. And his church is relatively small.
Yeah.
And so, here we are, we were able to really help, in the sense of people coming into Melbourne from around the country. And they're like, we don't even know of a church. And so he came out and said, hey, this is what I teach, the word of God. I teach prophecy. So that was really helpful.
Yeah.
But in reality, they are doing everything that you would imagine is except opposite of what you would want them to do, is to preparing the people for the return of Jesus.
So with that vacuum now that's being left there in Australia, what spiritual reality is filling that vacuum in Australia? What seems to be the upsurge there?
From the way he described is complete worldlyism, if you wanted to say it that way. And he did say as well that, as we're driving around, he said that the occult is becoming very strong there.
Really?
I mean, psychic, all the way around. He's like, you have no idea. He goes, it's pretty strong here.
Wow.
In Melbourne and where he was at. And so, again, as you just said, it was good words that there's a spiritual vacuum. But as we know, when people don't want God, Satan is glad to fill the vacuum with his own agenda. And that's what's happening. Sure
is. So, you talked in, I think, one of your presentations about the rise of anti-Semitism, global anti-Semitism. Kind of help us understand what's happening in Australia and New Zealand about that. Are we seeing the same thing there as we're seeing in the West?
Well, it's, if you look at their leadership, they have been some of the strongest anti-Israel people.
Yeah.
In fact, many the previous leadership and the current leadership of both places, they're going to recognize a Palestinian state, and it's mind-boggling because of the history of the relationship. Generally speaking, historically, Israel has had a great relationship with Australia and other things.
Yeah.
So to see them come out in force in adamant ways, even voting against Israel in some of the more recent UN agenda votes. I think Israel's actually kind of hurt by it. They're shocked by it.
Yeah.
But when you look at their history, for example, even though they're part of the Anglosphere, if you want to say that, the British Commonwealth idea,
Yeah.
they don't have the same level of I would say heritage that, for example, the Balfour Declaration had.
Sure.
Of England and Britain itself in at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So they have gone very much away from the Christian roots, and even that history of support for the Jewish people as a homeland. So shocking. The increase again in anti-Semitism that you're there, even whether it's not kind of like what's happening in was happening in some of the universities in America, where you see these developments in the universities or protests, and nothing's done about it. It's kind of like just the only terrorism that is allowed in some of the universities are the ones that are anti-Semitic, and it's shocking.
Isn't that crazy? So obviously, if the churches are vacant, I mean, obviously there's a remnant there, but the churches are vacant, then really there's no one to push back on that anti-Israel thing. Because even if the churches are functioning, they probably have that insidious doctrine of replacement theology anyway. So it's not even flying on their radar. So what do you think prophetically is happening? I'm seeing Canada quadruple in its anti-Semitism. I'm hearing from you, Australia. Definitely see it in Europe. I see it in a lot of Western societies. I just saw the son of Hamas at Oxford. And I don't know if you've seen this guy, but he grew up in Hamas and in the Palestinian, and he goes to Oxford and tells them straight up, this is what's happening. This is what's going on the ground. And they were booing him, shouting him down. And it's like, okay, are we seeing a new anti-Semitism, Mondo? That's different. And what I mean by that is it's different in the fact that it's different from what we saw in Nazi Germany, in the fact that it's spread and it's different groups, and it's not just the Nazis. What's your take on that?
Oh, 100%. I find it fascinating that, all of us have recognized that there's always, even since World War II, for, the past several generations, anti-Semitism has always been little pockets here and there. But the most shocking thing to me was to see that the lid was just busted off after October 7th. Mm-hmm. You would think that October 7th would provide an increased level of sympathy and compassion for what the Israeli people have had to endure with Hamas and all of their desire to remove Israel off the map. And of course, it's been there. But to see the atrocities happen, you think, oh, okay, clearly this is going to be helpful to Israelis to get compassion from the world. Shockingly, ironically, it's been the opposite. So from October of 23, anti-Semitism, as we know, protests around the world have increased exponentially. Yeah. And what the fascinating thing I think about this is why it's different. As you said, you have certainly, localized in one sense into Nazi Germany and World War II. But now it transcends countries, groups, nations, peoples. I mean, you think, and the main thing that I would describe it as is it's irrational. It's illogical. And so that tells me if it's irrational, then this is a spiritual issue. Because think about the irrationality, for example, of, the LGBTQ movement being pro-Hamas. Right. And yet if they lived there, they would be killed immediately. Yeah. So see, when I see stuff like that, it's irrational. They are unable, which surprisingly is when you're unable to connect the dots like that, there's a spiritual blindness there. And so this level of spiritual blindness and with the increase of anti-Semitism is absolutely shocking. But again, I wouldn't be surprised. It's a sign of the times.
So let me ask you this from a theological standpoint. God uses sometimes negatives that happen in our own personal life to get us to do something. He did it with the early church in Acts. They started having persecution, and it caused them to spread out because they were all clumped up in Jerusalem. Do you think the negative of anti-Semitism that God is allowing is meant to do something to Israel?
100%.
And
because
what is that?
Well, this is what we know scripturally. I've shared, even going back as far as your conference in last fall, that, Israel as a nation, it's like watching the book of Judges, that people who are replacement theologians, they try to look at the current state of modern Israel, which is very bad. Let's be honest, the spiritual state.
Yeah, right.
They reject Jesus. They reject Jesus. Clearly, there's a lot of immorality that, we recognize that.
Sure.
But they try to use that as a way to say that because of that immorality in Israel today, that they're not God's people. And I'm like, well, have you read the book of Judges? I mean,
right.
all the negatives that happen in the book of Judges, they were still God's people the whole time. They didn't lose their covenant relationship with God simply because they were immoral. I mean, read the Old Testament. I mean, how clueless is that? And so, but what you do see though, and this is what we know, that the 70th week of Daniel is the time of Jacob's trouble. Jeremiah 30, verse 7, right? So we know as well that the purpose of the tribulation period, Daniel 12:7, is to shatter the power of the holy people, which is a lot of, again, anti-Semitism and murder spree by the Antichrist himself.
Yeah.
Zechariah 13, we know the passage is about, 2/3 and 1/3. So when you look at what's happening now, this flavor of anti-Semitism that's going worldwide is going to fit right into the Antichrist's agenda, and we know that this hatred and his ability to murder them specifically during the second half of the tribulation is part of the purpose that God says, listen, you've rejected me, and they're going to reject him fresh with the reception of the Antichrist as their messianic figure, and of course the temple and all that. But God's heart, what's God's heart? To save them. And as we look at the book of Judges, what did he do? He sent, I say this often in one sense, that God sent the Philistines in the book of Judges to oppress Israel in their times of rebellion. And I don't think it's any coincidence that where's Gaza? Gaza is the land of the Philistines. So again, what's God's heart? His heart is for Israel. His heart is to reach them. But what we're watching is absolutely part of the prophetic trends.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the church is sitting this one out because they don't know that, or they have replacement theology. And I think I want you to weigh in on this because this is a problem in the church about this. I'm seeing a lot of problems in the church here in America where, Mondo, they may have replacement theology, but they don't even see the political necessity of supporting a democracy like Israel in the Middle East. And this is where I scratch my head. It's like, fine, you want to believe in replacement theology, but from what I understand from a military standpoint, having Israel in the Middle East is like having a U.S. aircraft carrier permanently stationed right there in the middle. And Mondo, help me understand, why can't they even see that politically, that it's advantageous to America to have Israel there?
Yeah, when you look, you can't say it any better than that. When you look around at Syria or Lebanon or Egypt, these are all dictatorships. They're all military dictatorships, or, again, if you go to Saudi Arabia, a kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. So, or, Iran, it's a religious dictatorship. So, and you think, here you have the light of democracy, which, again, this is the mantra of the left, right? Example.
Right.
But, and yet they come against Israel here. And so when you come into the church, I think you hit it as well, is that this is a theological issue. When you have replacement theology, which is, again, is a theological error, you're going to be blind to these other rationalities. And so you're going to buy, when you don't have that anchor of scripture, again, of understanding the covenant relationship that God has with Israel and the future for Israel, these other areas are going to become blind as well. And so then it allows you not to see. And not all of them are this way. Some of them say, well, I see it's a democracy, but yet I still have this feeling against Israel. Well, where's that feeling coming from?
Yeah,
again, that's a spiritual issue there when you recognize that, again, when you're anchored into a false theology, that's Satan's playground. And so it's not going to allow you to understand these other, in a sense, non-theological issues like democracy. So to me, I'm not surprised at all by it.
So yeah, let me go down one more step further, and I want you to use your pastor's intuition and discernment on this one. So, say a guy has replacement theology, okay? So that's an error theologically. And I agree with you totally. Does that open the door to more deception? Because let me give you an example. There are pastors out there that are now supporting Hamas and saying that Israel's committing genocide, Israel's starving out the Gazans, which is patently not true. And then they're willing to take the statistics from Hamas leadership of how much death has occurred. And I'm like, who's going to believe Hamas? But what I'm noticing is they have no problem believing the lies that are coming out from Hamas or the media. So I guess back to my question, when we start believing in error, does that open the door to believing more error and more lies, I guess?
Oh, 100%, because again, this is like, 1 John 4, 1 Timothy 4, where you have doctrines of demons in that regard, where, again, you have this theological error of replacement theology. And it goes back to, okay, guys, you're a brother in Christ. I love you. We're all going to go to heaven together. And if you have this error, that's fine. But how is it then, like you said, it leads over to the next area where it's hard for me not to see a connection, where an error leads to irrationality. Yeah. It's irrational to believe the murderous people of Hamas, and they are, and again, or maybe it's ignorance. Could they truly not understand the scenario of the situation of what Hamas does? They are masters at propaganda. They have their own Hollywood areas where they have people there with children they're still alive, but they're faking to be dead. And then the guy's crying, and then the child moves. He's like, well, the child's supposed to be dead. Yeah. So people, either they're ignorant of this. But again, if they're not ignorant, then it becomes, wait, that spiritual issue of why do you have such hatred to Israel that you would listen to these wicked individuals? I mean, look, which country right now I'll just ask this, if you want to be rational, is Russia putting down flyers for neighborhoods that it's going to bomb? Is it warning to people like for example, Israel's doing in Yemen right now? It's putting out flyers in order, it's several ports saying, hey, look, we're coming in. Your terrorists are using these places. We're going to be bombing it. We don't want anybody to be hurt. Okay, which country does that? Yeah, now, Israel's not perfect in all its ways, but no other country does it. So they're unable to see something as rational and logical, or when they see it, they dismiss it. Like, oh, well, that's not true. And you go, again, there's an irrationality there. It's not logical in this normal common sense realm. And of course, that leads you to, I think, there's a spiritual blindness there. Okay, so now I'm gonna go one step further into theology. So we got these Calvinists out there, and not all of them, but some of them say it is impossible, what you're saying, Mondo and Brandon, that a believer can be deceived. If they're truly a believer, they cannot be deceived. Can you speak to that? Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because I think this is one of the misunderstandings of, theology. For example, we see in Matthew 24 that Jesus says, if it was possible, even the elect would be deceived, okay? Yeah. So, but what people do is, what is Jesus referring to there? It's in the context of false messiahs and false Christs and false prophets, okay? Right. It's a context. So I think it's context. I think what Jesus is saying there, it's not that every Christian that's living, or every believer, tribulation saint, however you want to describe it, living in the tribulation is not going to have, they're going to have zero areas of theological error. I mean, we all have it in some degrees. We don't know what it is. Exactly. Right. So he's not saying that.
I've been wrong many times, man.
Absolutely. We go and we refine things, we understand things, but what Jesus is saying there is, look, that the elect not be deceived is about Jesus the Messiah. That is the key factor in all this, that they are never going to be deceived out of understanding that Jesus is the Messiah and believing in the false Messiah or the Antichrist, right? So when we, to say that that a Christian cannot have errors in his theology in these non-salvation areas, secondary, tertiary doctrines, where do you get that from? That's the point of studying and learning. And we all, again, that's Romans 14. You have these disputable doctrines that we might disagree with. So to say that a Christian can't be deceived in these non-salvation issues, where do you get that? That's not in the Bible by any means.
I agree. And so it's almost like a non-starter. If you really believe that, then how in the world do we argue over secondary and tertiary gray areas? It's just like, wow. So then either I must be unsaved because if I don't believe in replacement theology, then I must be deceived, and therefore the logical conclusion is I'm not saved if I could be deceived. And so, I mean, it doesn't even make sense, Mondo. But I throw that out there because this is kind of some of the argumentation we're starting to deal with. And Mondo, it's not even debatable it's a non-starter if you think like that. And you're right, that whole passage is all of the discourse. That is the tribulation period. That's Israel and all during that period of time. And to use that as a broad brush principle of saying, no, believers cannot get deceived, then I don't know what all the warnings are for.
Yep.
I mean...
You would never need to worry about it. Yep.
Right. We would never have to worry
it's impossible.
About it. It's impossible. So why? So the warnings are what, hypotheticals all of a sudden? It's crazy. Okay, let me go this route. Okay. So the modern state of Israel is in unbelief. And so help us understand what that even means theologically. That doesn't mean then, because I am a Christian Zionist, that I agree with everything that Israel's government does. Because people think you guys just write blank checks to Israel. You don't, you guys are just turning a blind eye if they mess up or whatever. And I'm like, well, no, that's not our view as Christian Zionists. Help us understand the balance. We understand that.
You know, I had a conversation with somebody recently where it wasn't really a debate. It was more of but we were in different camps. They really believed in. They don't like replacement theology. They prefer fulfillment theology or promise theology. You know, just a different term, but it was the same theology. Okay, however we title
Semantics,
it. Okay,
right?
Semantics, and again, brother in the Lord, love him, serving God. That's great. But the question was, is there a future for Israel? And so I said, look. Let's go to Romans 9 for a minute. Yeah. Let's camp here for a second, because when context is important. When was this written? It was written in the early 50s AD. Okay, Paul's writing to the Romans, and he says quite clearly that Israel was in a state nationally of unbelief at this time. They had rejected their Messiah, no doubt, and 70 AD was coming quick. Okay, so but Paul writes this, and he says, "To them belong the promises, the covenants, the oracles of God." And I said, notice what Paul writes. He doesn't say to them belonged, like they lost it, past tense. It's present tense. So Paul is writing to the Romans about the Jews who were in a state of rebellion against God at this time, the national. Of course, there were individual Jews like Paul, okay? But nationally, they had rejected. But he says, still belonging to them in the present tense is all these privileges. And here, now fast forward almost 2,000 years later, 1,980 years later, or 70 years later, here we are. And yet what? Israel's in a state of rebellion. They're in a state of unbelief.
Sure.
And to them still belong the promises, the covenants, the patriarchs, and the Messiah, okay? So all of that is still true. And when we look at Israel, and I'll say it this way, again, going back to the book of Judges, it's just easy. The Bible says God can't deny himself, right? So why did God support Israel in the book of Judges? Well, because of his promise, he says it in Deuteronomy 9, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yeah. He says, you guys don't deserve to be in the land. You have never deserved to be in the land. They don't deserve to be in the land now. They didn't deserve it in the time of Moses. God says that, Deuteronomy 9. Yeah. Not because you're righteous, but I made a promise.
That's right.
To Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God cannot deny his people. That's why Romans 11 says the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So right now, why do we support Israel? Well, God didn't support Israel because Israel was righteous. We don't support Israel today because they're righteous. We support it because the promises of God have a future for Israel. Yes. And so ultimately what we're doing is we're standing on the promises of God that God made to the patriarchs. Amen. So we're following God's example. God, again, did not approve of Israel because they were righteous, and neither do we. But we trust in God's word and his future promises for national Israel.
That hit the nail on the head, because It is about the promises, and it doesn't mean that I turn a blind eye if they do silly things like injecting their people 95% with the injection. I totally disagree with that. I totally disagree with them giving the Gaza over in 2005 and other things, okay? And I'm glad you clarified it, because we support Israel as a Christian Zionist because of the promises of God and because of the character in God. I want you to, you mentioned covenants, and I think this is important for our audience to understand. Explain to people the difference between a unilateral Caesarean covenant versus like the Mosaic covenant, which is conditional, because that lends itself into this argumentation: can God abrogate a unilateral covenant?
Yes, what you see in Scripture, going back to Genesis 12, you have the Abrahamic covenant. And if you go to Genesis 15 and 17, you see God, again, saying, this is what I'm going to do. Yes. All through Genesis 12. It's not, hey, Abraham, I'm going to do this if you do this. God said, I'm going to do this. And out of that Abrahamic covenant, you have three covenants. You have the land, which is the Palestinian, or the so-called Palestinian covenant in Deuteronomy 30, classically anyway. Right. And then you have the seed. You have the Davidic covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7. And then you have the blessing, which is from you, Abraham, all the nations, all the families will be blessed. Yes. And that's the new covenant, Jeremiah 31. Right. So those are all unilateral covenants, eternal covenants. And then, but what you do see is, again, in the book of Exodus, you have this Mosaic covenant, which was added as a temporary covenant. We see that in Galatians 3:19, Ephesians chapter 2. We can name them all, right? So God says, listen, this Mosaic covenant is temporary. And it's going to be fulfilled in the person of Jesus. But what did they do? They rebelled. That's why in Jeremiah 31, in discussing the implementation of the new covenant, he says, this is not going to be like the covenant that I made with you, with your fathers, the Mosaic one, which you broke, okay? But there's going to be a new covenant. But the breaking of the Mosaic covenant, and that's Paul's whole point in Galatians 3, that it came later.
Yes.
The Mosaic covenant in Galatians 3 came after the Abrahamic covenant, which was permanent. So it says very clearly, just because something was added, it doesn't annul the previous covenant, which is, again, God's promise to Abraham. Right. And then ultimately to Isaac and Jacob, the patriarchs. And so, yes, Israel has been breaking the covenant we see all through Old Testament history. But again, my classic state is, go to the book of Judges. They were wicked. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes, because why? There was no king in Israel. But God did not abandon them just because of the disobedience. He had a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which he's going to keep. And so if we fail to understand, if we only focus on the breaking of the Mosaic covenant, and we neglect those eternal permanent covenants that are still in force, that's what I think Romans 9 and 11 are talking about, the covenants of blessing and how we're grafted in. We're grafted into those permanent covenants. Yeah. And that's why we receive the blessings of those covenants. The root is the Abrahamic covenant. So, so in your opinion, theologically, what do you think covenant theology or Reformed theology is doing? Do you think they're conflating the Mosaic covenant with, the Abrahamic land and all that, and then just putting it all together, saying, well, look, they broke it, and God says, I'm going to kick you out of the land for breaking it. Are they conflating the two? How are they missing that? Or is it because of the hermeneutics? What is that? You nailed it there. I think what we see in covenant theology, again, love people, brothers in there, but what you find is, again, just for clarity, that we're not saying they're unsaved by any means. No. But the classic example is hermeneutics, because when you talk to them about, for example, messianic prophecy, Micah 5:2, Bethlehem, Isaiah 7:14, born of a virgin, you name it, messianic prophecy of Jesus' first coming, all of them, they take it literal. They take it normal. Sure. They take all of that literal normal. But then somehow they switch in the middle of the game to the second coming prophecies as being figurative or metaphorical. And you're like, hey, guys, why would the second coming prophecies be figurative and metaphorical when you yourselves take the first coming to be literal? So, but what that also does is, with that hermeneutic of figurativism, if you want to say, or metaphoricalism, they get that historically from Augustine primarily and Origen, because especially from those from a covenant theology, they're reformed in their perspective, they're reformed in their soteriology, and it goes back to St. Augustine. So in that regard, when they look at these covenants like Abraham, they don't necessarily think in terms, they're not denying that those covenants existed, but for them, covenant theology by definition is the covenant of works that was allegedly agreed with Adam, There's no record of that, but that's a theological inference that they make, and versus the covenant of grace. So they see only two covenants.
Wow.
That's primarily how they see things. And so when they look at, for example, the Mosaic covenant, they're confused that it was a temporary covenant. This is why for them, many of them want to follow some of the Old Testament Mosaic system.
Good point. Good point.
And so, because they fail to see that Mosaic covenant was temporary and it was broken and it's over.
Right.
This is why they're like, well, we're one people of God. And so they confuse that Israel is separate, that the law of Moses, the 613 commands, were for Moses and Israel, if it says very clearly. And so they go, well, how do we bring over some of those into the church? Because we got to have that continuity. So I appreciate their desire for continuity, but at the same design, their hermeneutics don't allow them to see the discontinuity there and the breaking and the removal, the temporary nature of that covenant.
I hit the nail on the head about the continuity desire, and I think that's where I believe dispensation. When I was studying this 30 years ago, what made the most sense is that Paul used the word ekonomia, dispensational. And we started realizing, wait, God's handling his people at different times, at different places, in different ways. And to not acknowledge that seems like, I guess it's called, I would say it, a theological flattening of all the covenants. Because what is there, like something like 8 covenants? You got the Noahic covenant and the Edenic covenant and all these other things. But then if you make it all just about a covenant of works versus a covenant of grace, it seems, Mondo, that you flatten all of that out theologically, and you're really not taking in the Davidic covenant, the Abrahamic, the land. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Then it's I guess it's desire for continuity, but then in that desire, you're going to make pretty big theological mistakes if you're saying, well, the church is just the continuation of spiritual Israel. By the way, define that word for us, spiritual Israel, because it's used in the New Testament and Galatians, but what is that referring to?
Yes, I think that it has been, as much as they might dispute it, there is not a single time in the entire Bible where Israel is used of the church.
Yes.
Even in Galatians 6:16, which you make reference to, even upon the Israel of God there.
Yeah, the Israel of God,
Yep, they will say that, oh, that's a reference to the church. And in fact, in context, it clearly is not. Again, let me reiterate, not a single time in the Bible does Israel ever refer to a non-Jew. And so, again, I wrote an article for our magazine not too long ago where I looked up, I examined every place the word Jew appeared, every place the word Hebrew appeared, and examined all of the places of the word Israel, 2,500 times in there.
Wow.
And what you see is in there, every single time, those words are all synonymous. Jew, a Hebrew, and Israel synonymous, and never once does it refer to a non-ethnic Gentile. Never once. And so the struggle that they have is because they even if they said, okay, one time in Galatians 16, which I disagree with, so one time now is going to extrapolate that to all these other times to say, when you see Israel in the Bible, just think of the church, just think of that. It's totally false. And I would say this too, that look, everybody who's an honest Christian, or at least a knowledgeable Bible believer, is dispensational to some degree. And I'm not saying they embrace all of what we understand as dispensational system.
Right.
But I just asked the question, when did you do your sacrifice this week?
Right, exactly, good point.
And they're going to go, well, no. And you go, well, why not? And you have to sometimes force them. Are you saying, would you agree that sacrifices were part of the previous dispensation? Mm-hmm. Say it. Come on, say it. I know you don't want to, but yes, we're all dispensationalists to some degree, at least to the sense of there was the dispensation of Adam and Eve before the garden. Okay, that's one.
Right.
And then they sinned. Okay, so now we're in the second one.
Yeah.
And then if you want to, okay, fine. But now we're in at least a third. And then heaven will, if you want heaven or the whatever, the millennial reign, which they often reject at the fourth. But they at least believe in 3.
Yes.
Adam and Eve, Old Testament, and now we're under the new. So again, why? Because as you said, the word appears in Ephesians 3.
Yeah.
Dispensation is not a bad word. It's in the Bible.
Right, exactly. And that's a good point. Good point. So I want to pivot now with the time remaining because I want to go back to your latest book. Since we're talking about Israel and the issue of Israel, and it seems like the the hoofbeats are beating down, and we see the birth pains coming. Your latest book about the red heifer, I want to talk on that a little bit with the time remaining. And if someone's unfamiliar, why is the red heifer so significant? You wrote a whole book about it.
Yeah, I was encouraged because, or inspired would be a good word, is because we know that in September 15th of 2022, 5 red heifers came over to Israel at one time.
Yeah.
And so, of course, that there was a lot of public fanfare for it. Even in the Israeli news, they had like the Minister of Interior there to welcome the red heifers, and of course, now they're in Shiloh. You've been there.
Yes.
And so what it did is it brought up the question, as a Christian, and that's my first chapter, why should I care about 5 red heifers coming to Israel? Who cares? Well, the reason why we care is because of the prophetic scenario that the Bible says crystal clear that there's going to be a third temple in the future. At least during the 70th week of Daniel, this 7-year period, there's going to be a temple being built. Sacrifices will be offered, and we don't know exactly when, but we know that they will be discontinued or ceased by the midpoint of the tribulation period. So at the minimum, how long is the temple there? We don't know. All we know is, did they start offering sacrifices one day before the midpoint? Don't know. 1 year, 2 years, we don't know.
Right.
We just know that the Bible says it's going to be there. And so the second thing that we know is that these rabbinic Jewish people, they've been having their minds on rebuilding the temple since 70 AD, but they became a nation in 48, and then in 67, you have from that conquering of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount Faithful group, and then you have the Temple Institute group. You have all these groups. Right. And one of the things that they recognize is, hey, look, even if we could build the temple, we can't fully use it without the ashes of the red heifer, because according to the Bible, Numbers 19, the red heifer ashes are needed in order to purify the people so they can participate in the full implementation of all of the temple services.
Gotcha.
And so they realized, hey, we need to find either the old ashes of the red heifer, maybe in an archaeological find, which they haven't found, or we start searching for a new red heifer and to perform the ceremony and collect new ashes.
Gotcha.
And so my goal in the book was to say, listen, when this happens, when the ceremony happens, my goal was to equip the Christian to understand all of the background of theologically, it's in the Bible. Not only that, but what the rabbis say, as well as the prophetic implications. And then secondly, to use it. Why are we here? We do this because we want to use this as an opportunity to evangelize.
Sure.
We want to say, look around. This is what the Bible said. This happens. Look, prophecy is being fulfilled right in front of our eyes. Hey, everybody, it's time to be ready for Jesus.
Yeah, amen, amen. And there's with these 5, what's the timing on being able to sacrifice them?
What you have is there is only a minimum, and that minimum is 2 years and 8 days.
Okay.
And so the 2 years and 8 days came to fruition in November of 23. So now, we're coming up. They had to be that. So now they're going on, 4 years old. There is no upper age limit. That is very crystal clear in the Talmudic literature. Okay. I wrote about that in the book. There's no upper age limit. The only thing that you have is the longer you wait, the more risk that you have that someone could harm the animal, they could get a blemish, or they grow some non-red hairs. So it's more a matter of the longer you wait, the more risk you have for disqualification.
I find that amazing, in the fact that here we are with the convergence of events. Israel's back in the land, again, a birth pain. And then, we know there's going to be a temple. But, here's the thing. So these red heifers appear all of a sudden. It's been, 2,000 years, something like that? I don't know. And all of a sudden, they're making an appearance. Okay, if they have a temple then, how can the Jews know who can be a Levitical priest if the records were destroyed in 70 AD of the genealogical lines? I can hear someone making that accusation saying, well, okay, fine, but they don't even know who can serve in the temple. How would Israel find that out?
So what they've done is, there's no doubt there has been records, as we know, in the temple. But as they were scattered around the world, we see this, for example, in many of the names. You might have, let's say you have a guy named Simon Leventhal.
Okay.
Well, that's interesting. Well, that's a connection with Levi, right? Sure. So what they've done is you have a variety of these names. Sometimes, or even it would be like Simon Levi. They have the name, but secondly, if you were to go 100 years ago, Jewish rabbis would still argue that they have family traditions and family lines where they could trace this. But today, with those people that make the claim, we have genetic studies now. I mean, it is undeniable. If you were to take these people that claim certain connections to the Levitical priesthood, and you take their genetic markers, and then you look at all the other ones that are making the claim, the genetic markers match up.
Yeah.
So you have these verifications now within genetics to show that these people did not fully assimilate their genetics out of them. Anyway, regardless, you could go back and say, well, yeah, way back in my historical line is the tribe of Levi. And so when you see some of these things, we're living in exciting times where the technology like genetics or genetic studies allows an opportunity to verify claims that are simply made. It's again, if people look around, whether it's the 5 red heifers arriving or full breeding programs, which are now in place, these weren't in there 50 years ago.
Right, exactly.
I mean, they were not here. All these things absolutely are converging in the present 2025 moment.
I think that's just absolutely exciting as a Bible student, because you're right. Without technology of reaching that point to where we could look at DNA, right, and breed cows and stuff like that and whatnot, I mean, it's just amazing. Okay, so now I want to tap into your archaeological expertise. How in the world are they going to get the Temple Mount? And I want you to address this notion. There's a guy out there, I think it's Cornig, I think.
Oh, Bob Cornuke?
Yeah, Bob Cornuke. And then he was taking his information off another guy, and I can't remember the guy's name, but maybe you do. But they were saying that the Temple Mount was actually not where the temple was, that was a Roman garrison, and that the Temple Mount was structured over Mount Zion. Can you speak to that as an archaeologist?
Yes. What you see is Bob Cornuke and others. I mean, again, he loves the Lord, not saying he's not a Christian. Okay, just people accuse us, so I always say that just to make sure.
You have to qualify everything.
You have to qualify. You really do. And so, and there's others that would say that, like what most of where they got their information from was from a scholar named Ernest Martin.
That's it. That's the name. Yeah.
Yep. He wrote a book called The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so what he described there was his claims. He made a lot of claims, which I think he was wrong, but he made a lot of references to Josephus describing that the current Temple Mount that we see, the 37 acres, was again the Antonia fortress, and that the temple itself in all of its buildings was down in the city of David, which we know is directly south down the hill in what is known as the city of David excavations. And so I can tell you this, that when Ernest Martin wrote his book, in the late 80s, early 90s, right around 1990, you think, okay, it's really easy to make claims about a lot of things. And according to him, he had some textual history, again, like Josephus. But, that was 25, 35 years ago. And so with all of the work that has been done in the city of David excavations, impossible. Now, back then, again, you could say things because it was unverified. The city of David wasn't as excavated as it was now. Right. But with all the work, they've gone down, they've seen the citadel of David, they've seen the palace now, they've discovered all these other things. And you know what was not there?
What's that?
The temple. The temple. There's no way at all that the temple would fit there.
Right.
There's no archaeological even scenario possible that all the things that are described about the temple of Herod and all the work that he did would fit in the city of David. It's simply just not possible. And again, they've been able to excavate down back into the Iron Age, the first Iron Age 1, which is 1200 BC. And you know what? They don't find any evidence of the Herodian structure, foundations, anything. So this idea that the original Solomon's temple or the temple of Herod, the second temple, was down in the city of David, archaeologically, there's not a single archaeologist that is in the know, that has worked, that would look at that and even give it a possibility of it being true.
Well, I'm glad you put a cap on that, because, man, it gets thrown all over the internet and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so I'm glad you nailed that one. That's great. So here's my question, last question for you, and I got to let you run. What's your theory? And I know it's going to be a theory because we're none of us know. How in the world do you think Israel's going to get control of that Temple Mount to have their temple on there?
Well, there's a couple things that I think are building. One of them is what we're observing right now as it relates to the Abrahamic Accords and all of the entrapments that come along with it. Because we know, for example, when in 1967 during the Six-Day War, Moshe Dayan, who was an atheist, he was one of the generals that came in. He's the guy with the patch, if people see him in history. He comes in and they conquer the Temple Mount area. And of course, at that time, the Jews run in. Man, they run in and they're so excited to be there to get to the Western Wall. Well, we know that because of his atheism, again, his own self-attested, he didn't care about any religious ideas. And so they gave control back to the WAQ, the WAQF, right? Which is Jordanian control. But what's happening now is you see a trend, and I don't know whether you said theorize, we're theorizing, that Saudi Arabia has offered to take over control of the Temple Mount from Jordan. And they seek to administer it in a way that is more cosmopolitan, because that's kind of the way that they roll. And so there is a tendency that, is it possible, again, we're theorizing, conjecturing, that could it be that in some level of Abrahamic Accords that the Crown Prince, the young one, MBS, that he comes along and says, hey, look, and they've said pretty clear, we don't care about the Temple Mount from an official position. We care about Mecca and Medina. The Temple Mount's for the Jews. Again, Jerusalem's not even mentioned in the Quran once. So they're a little bit more purist in their mentality. So that's one way, is that they come along and they provide a level of security or an endorsement for Israel. The other way is, at least scripturally speaking, I believe quite strongly that Daniel 9:27, when the Antichrist makes a covenant with the many, which is the Jews, this isn't many nations. I think he is in, literally what it says is he causes to, it's a phrase, causes to prevail, which is literally what the Hebrew says when you compare it with the Greek Septuagint, blah, blah, blah. He causes to prevail the covenant. So I think what he's doing there is he's establishing the Mosaic covenant. I think the covenant in the book of Daniel is about the Mosaic covenant. This is what the Jews want. They want the Mosaic covenant. I don't necessarily think it's a peace treaty. The word peace doesn't appear anywhere in there. But what he's doing there is, and what do we know? He's right in the next phrase, they are stopping the sacrifices and the offerings. So within the context of Daniel 9:27 is the temple. So I think what's happening there is, how do they build the temple? I think the Antichrist, in whatever authority he has at the beginning of the 7th week, he is able to cause the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, to be established throughout the land, which is what the Jews want. They believe that's what the Messiah is going to do. It's pretty fascinating. If you ask a Jewish rabbi today, what's the Messiah going to do? They go, oh, he's going to uphold Torah. Well, what's Torah? Well, it's Moses. He's going to uphold Moses. And so I think that ultimately, the things that we're seeing with Saudi Arabia and others are going to provide a little bit more sympathy. But when the Antichrist comes on the scene, it's going to be fully implemented with his authority, whatever that is. And I think that is when they will establish the temple and start the sacrifices.
Good deal. Good deal. And the John Walvoord, the great, Prince of Prophecy from Dallas, he said it this way, and you're hitting the nail on the head in your theory. The generation that lives closest to these things occurring will understand them the best. And I think that every year, Mondo, as we get closer and closer, things start unfolding in front of us. And okay, we have these signposts, but then you and I are able to see how the world gets to that signpost. Who would ever think that Saudi Arabia would say, it's the Jews' place, it's not ours, man. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime, where a Muslim would say, we don't have any claim on the Temple Mount. I'm floored by that. But you're right, I think that plays into things as well. And as we watch things unfold, it starts adding up. The technology of controlling the whole world, the digital currency, and everything else. It's just, Now we have AI, and you think about the temple, since we're talking about it, and I got to let you go. I'm just could go on forever, man. Sorry. But I don't know what you think. We're talking about the temple, but the image inside the temple or that's set up by the Antichrist that has the ability to speak, right, and has the ability to kill you. What's your theory on that?
Oh, that's a great conjecture. And again, as we throw it out there, I do think if you read the okay, it's fun to talk in our culture about pronouns, right? Well, what's your pronoun? Well, if you follow the pronouns, especially in the Greek of Revelation 13, what you will see there is that the image is set up. There's power given to the image to speak. Yeah. But then it goes on and it talks that the image is the one that causes the mark of the beast.
Okay.
If you read it very carefully, you'll see it causes the all to take a mark. And you're like, who's it? Why is it speaking it?
Right.
It's talking about the image. So to me, if we were to look at that in some way, some level of technology, if you want to put artificial super intelligence in there as an example, the ability to speak, whatever that sentience is, we don't have all the details. Yeah. But what it does, whatever it is, it has the power to cause a mark to be put so that people don't buy and sell. So is that going to be a hologram? I'm not sure, but there's no doubt it's going to have some connection to be able to enforce this economic mark around the world of the beast itself. To me, it's pretty phenomenal. And again, that would be impossible 20 years ago,
Bingo.
50 years ago.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think it's the convergence of events coming together, and it's like, it's all coming together to prepare for that last week of Daniel's 70th week, man. No, that's great. That's great. I'm sorry I kept you too long. I got to let you run, man. But we appreciate you. I love your insight, Mondo. You guys are doing great at Prophecy Watchers, man. And thanks for your time, brother. How can people find you, man?
If they just go to prophecywatchers.com, they can find kind of the conduit to find us everywhere. And Brandon, it's always good to hang out. I appreciate you having me on.
You betcha, man. God bless you. Have a great one. And folks, remember what the Lord said. When you see these things begin to happen, whether it's Israel or the temple or the red heifer, look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time. Hey, everybody, I need your help. And I need your help in 3 different areas. First of all, I need your help on our channel. Our channel is working against an algorithm, and so we need you to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. And if you'll do that, that helps us get the message out to many people. It outdoes the algorithm that's working against us. So if you'll do those things, real simple, like, subscribe, hit the bell, it'll get our message out to as many people as possible. The second thing you could do to help us out is prayer. We get a lot of pushback online from not only human beings, but from the demonic realm as well. And so we need prayer. And so if you can pray for our ministry, that would greatly help us out. And third, it takes a lot of financial resources to put these programs on. And so we do a lot of filming, with a lot of editing, a lot of going on location. In fact, sometimes we film in Israel. And we film in Turkey and different places like that. So it takes a lot of money to do these special programs that we put together. And so we need finances. And so if the Lord puts it on your heart to help us, that would be greatly appreciated by us and our ministry. So those are the 3 ways you can help us. Pray to the Lord how you could do that. Real easy. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, pray, and financially support us. God bless you. Thank you so much.